we're beginning to see a lot of evidence that the losses on the Ukrainian side are far, far larger than anything we anticipated. At the same time, we've insisted repeatedly that the Russians were losing, that the Russians were incompetent, that they were stupid, they couldn't do anything. And still, in many newspapers and outlets, you hear this business of, well, the Russians are stuck. There's not much more they can do. That, too, is beginning to break down. People are figuring out the integrated air defenses are exceptionally effective. Hundreds of aircraft have been shot down, 402 fixed-wing aircraft, 256 helicopters, Ukrainian aircraft, that is. So the notion that you're going to send a few F-16s, train a few pilots, isn't going to make any difference to where things are headed. And the Russian military establishment is now larger and more powerful and capable than it has been, certainly in 30 years. So all of the stated goals and objectives, harm Russia, degrade Russia, weaken Russia, all of this has kind of gone by the wayside. And then to cap it off, we have the visit of the Chinese premier to Moscow. And it's very obvious now that the Chinese have cast their lot with the Russians because thanks to all of our belligerent statements and activities in Asia, the Chinese have concluded that they're next on the menu. Under the circumstances, you might as well support the Russians. But we also misinterpret what the Chinese are trying to achieve. We don't seem to understand that what the Chinese want to achieve is this one belt, one road. In other words, they want to build rail lines. They want to move commerce and trade back and forth across Central Asia, through Ukraine, through White Russia, into Europe. And the Europeans, of course, ultimately want to trade with China. The only way to do that is to end the war in Ukraine. And the Chinese are very interested in doing that. That's one of the reasons they came to meet as well with President Putin. And before the Chinese have managed to do very much, we are instantly refusing any offer that might be on the table for an end to this conflict. And I think at the same time, inside of Europe, certainly in Germany, and I think to a large extent now France and other countries, people are beginning to say, wait a minute, how long does this take? How many more people have to die? What do we do with a state the size of Ukraine that is virtually destroyed? How do we handle it? How do we rebuild it? How do we repatriate millions of people that have left the country? All of these things are coming together, and that is your gathering storm, if you will. And at some point, the storm is going to break out. And I don't think we're going to withstand it very well in the United States because of our own problems.
Regarding Ukraine, though, I was curious, how do you interpret the state of the war at the moment? I mean, I do not want to denigrate the Ukrainian army as they fought very bravely, but these horrifying losses can hardly be sustained. So I was wondering, where do you see Ukraine at this point, and what do you see Russia being up to next? Or what would you expect happening in the coming weeks?
Well, if you look at any of the film footage coming out of eastern Ukraine, you know that it is an enormous mud pit. And the black earth in Ukraine, which runs perhaps 3 to 5 to 6 meters deep in some places, is simply mud at the moment. If you try to drive anywhere across country off the asphalt roads or hard surface roads, whether you are in a tracked vehicle or wheeled vehicle, it doesn't matter very much. You're going to sink quickly. So in terms of large-scale offensive operations, it would move hundreds of thousands of forces forward against the enemy, which is what the Russians have established and built up in White Russia, around western Russia, and in southern Ukraine. That's not going to happen until we see the ground dry out. And again, the Russians had plans to do things in January, but the ground simply never froze. You had some areas where there was some freezing, particularly in the north, but you needed a very solid freeze for several weeks. It didn't happen. So what you're seeing in southern Ukraine is the Russians have decided to keep the pressure up along the entire front of about 160 miles. And you have these incremental movements forward. It's light infantry supported by a few platforms with heavy guns and autocannon, large numbers of drones being used to destroy any evidence for Ukrainian air defense, radars, rockets, and so forth, but enormous artillery power, not just hard shell ammunition from guns, but also lots of rockets and missiles. These things are being used to the point where whenever the Ukrainians move a formation of, say, brigade size, 2,500, 3,000, 4,000 forward, it's largely destroyed before it reaches the enemy. In other words, before the Ukrainians can close with the oncoming Russian enemy, they're being annihilated. And this is this ISR strike system that the Russians have really perfected at every level, tactical, operational, and strategic, which means that you have platforms in the air, in space, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, that are capable of capturing images and pictures and information and radio broadcasts and so forth that occur on the ground, rapidly targeting those things, transmitting that targeting data to artillery and rocket and missile systems, and then destroying the source. This is a terrible situation for the Ukrainians to be in. There's not a great deal they can do about it because the ratio is about 10 to 1 when it comes to these standoff attack systems and artillery. So the Ukrainians, if they continue to push forward, and they still are, in fact, I watched footage of a group of Ukrainians. This was almost a brigade-sized element, and they were moving along roads and across fields on foot, which you have to or you just sink, and they were annihilated by the Russians. The Russians saw them, identified them, and brought their artillery power to bear. This is also not sustainable. Now, the Ukrainians are continuing to send press gangs, that is, people all over the country, to force young boys, men, older men, particularly over the age of 40, anybody they can find, into vans. They take them, then they get some modicum of training and go to the front. And the rumors coming out of Ukraine says if you're one of those people, you have about a 3 to 4 hour life expectancy on the front lines. This is a disaster. Now, the Ukrainians are spending a lot of money on drones. We're giving them to them as rapidly as we can as compensation, a way to compensate for the lack of power on the ground. But the Russians are shooting these things down. You know, everybody forgets that these unmanned systems, whether they're rotor-driven or they're aircraft of some kind or jet-driven, they can be shot down just like airplanes. And if you have an effective integrated air defense, you're going to be able to do that. So at this point, I don't see any real hope that things will change in Ukraine. And the danger now is in the spring when the Russians finally launch their offensives, assuming there are no negotiations between now and, say, May, and the outlook for that is rather grim, let's face it, then the Russians will swarm over most of eastern Ukraine pretty rapidly, destroy whatever they find, and then pause at the Dnieper River and decide whether or not they're going to go further. And everything I see tells me that if we do not negotiate with them, we don't come to some sort of agreement on whatever is left of Ukraine regarding its future neutrality and end this nonsense about NATO membership, we're going to end up down the line with hundreds of thousands of Russian troops on the Polish border.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of these videos of the forced draft of these young men just pulled off the street. But this comes at a cost, I would think, because if you have all these people who are forced into the army, now you risk having your defensive lines collapsing. And so it just... is this sustainable? How much can you rebuild or keep pumping new men into the army, sending new equipment which they can't really operate? Is the quality degrading as well? Is that why we're seeing this kill ratio of 1 to 10? So that is for 10 Ukrainians for each Russian?
I'm sure that's some of it. Of course, Stalin did this successfully during the Second World War, and he had a much larger manpower pool. But by the end of the war, 50% of the so-called Soviet infantry consisted of non-Europeans, Central Asians that were forced into the Soviet armies. And ultimately, he was helped by the Germans because Adolf Hitler ordered everyone to stand fast and fight for every inch of territory, which effectively is something that Zelensky has done. In that part of the world, ground in and of itself has no real value. You give it up as necessary because it could easily be won back. There's not much out there that is very defensible. And that's another reason why this Bakhmut business has dragged on, because once you lose Bakhmut and you begin to move north and west, you run out of effective defenses. Now, you could build some new lines, but you'll never have the kind of intricate, complex, and effective defenses that you had in the Donbass that you built up over 8 years. So again, I don't see any good news for Ukraine. And my best hope right now is that the Europeans will take this in hand and recognize that the destruction of Ukraine is not in their interest. Recognize that you can negotiate with the Russians, but you're going to have to meet their demands. And their key demand is for neutrality for whatever remains of Ukraine. And I've always felt that that was a good solution. I favored that long before there was ever a war, because that places a buffer state between us and the Russians. And that buffer state can actually profit from being a buffer economically in ways that we've seen in Austria, because the Austrian model was always a good model for Ukraine, in my judgment. But that opportunity was lost. But if we persist, things will get worse. The Russians are prepared for the worst. I don't think we and the Europeans are prepared for the worst. I don't think we are prepared to go to war. In fact, I know we aren't. And so if you're not willing to fight, and I don't see any evidence that we and the Europeans are, then I think the other side is going to win. Now, the Poles, of course, are still very vocal. And just last week, there was a statement made that if it turns out that Ukrainians cannot defend themselves and their defense is destroyed, then we Poles will have to move and take the offensive, which I think is extremely dangerous. Again, the longer this lasts, the more the opportunity for stupid actions grows. And we have too many people that are not sufficiently worried about the humanitarian catastrophe in Ukraine. They're not sufficiently worried about the loss of human life. And this thing with the ICC that you pointed out, the Russians have found children in the war zone without parents, without family, alone. Yes, they've identified these children. They've moved them to where they could be cared for medically, and they're holding them until their parents can be found, which is a pretty damn difficult task in the middle of a war, as you know. But the notion that the Russians were deliberately corralling children and moving them to some sinister camp in Russia is a lot of nonsense. This is all crap. And what it demonstrates is that all the institutions in the West are essentially tools for the globalists. They no longer represent justice for all. They are basically simply puppet organizations that parrot whatever the globalist regimes that run the West want them to say and do. And this is very unhealthy. I can't imagine this ending well in Europe. It's not going to end well here in the United States.